welcome to our first podcast of the admission season. You've spent years on the inside at one of the world's most prestigious universities. What's the one thing about admissions that students and parents almost get it wrong?
They're very focused on the students that they know. In the US alone, there are more than 20,000 high schools. But in all cases, you would have spent maybe 15 minutes reading the file, taking notes, and then you would go into committee. And as the admissions officer, my job was to present the student to the committee.
So do the students who unfortunately don't make the cut, do they have an option to appeal an admission officer's decision?
You really couldn't necessarily point to a reason why a student didn't get in. It was much easier to point to a reason why a student did get in.
What's the one thing about admissions that students and parents almost get it wrong?
There are so many, but if I had to sort of select one big thing, I think it's that they think locally rather than globally. And by that, I mean, they're very focused on the students that they know and often how they stack up against those specific students, which in many cases is very well, right? They're good students. They've done interesting things. They, in many cases, will be really quite strong in their local community. But you always have to keep in mind when it comes to institutions like Penn and other Ivies and other highly selective institutions that they're getting a global applicant pool. And, yes. In the US alone, there are more than 20,000 high schools. And there are going to be top students at every single one of them. And there certainly aren't that many spots available in a freshman class every year at Penn or in any of the other Ivies. And so the biggest mistake I do think that they make is not understanding just how much competition there is out there and what they're up against.
Walk us through what happens in that room. How does a decision actually get made on a highly selective pool of applicants?
The reality is that different schools do it differently. And even the way that Penn does it now is a little different from when I was there. Penn does something interesting where they read in pairs. So they have two admissions officers who read different pieces of an application and then discuss it together. What is most common at most selective institutions is that there tends to be some type of a committee process. And the committee process can work in different ways. You can start in a small committee and move on to a larger committee. You could just go to committee as is. But once the applications are read, there is usually more than one person that's going to weigh in on whether or not the student is going to be admitted. So at Penn, we would have, I would go to committee for the applications that I had read in a given year, which was usually about 1,300. And we would have a committee chair. We would have a representative from the school at Penn that the student had applied to. So Penn has 4 undergraduate schools. They have a School of Nursing. They have College of Arts and Sciences. They have the School of Engineering, and they have the Wharton School of Business. And so a representative from one of those 4 schools would be there. And we would sit around the table. So in some cases, it would simply be 3 people. You might have a larger committee if the student was a recruited athlete. I did chair athletic committee as well when I was at Penn. And then we also had committees for individual programs. So there were a couple of joint degree programs at Penn. The Management and Technology program was one of them. The Huntsman program was another. So there were a few different joint degree programs, and that might include a larger group of people. So you would have representatives from the programs that would be there that would want to see the applicant pool and weigh in. But in all cases, you would have spent maybe 15 minutes reading the file, taking notes, and then you would go into committee. And as the admissions officer, my job was to present the student to the committee. and advocate for the decision that I thought was appropriate. It was my job to know my region, to know which students were really standing out in my region. In the time that I was at Penn, my region changed. One constant was I always had the state of Connecticut for some reason, but sometimes I had Connecticut and I had all of New England except for Massachusetts a couple of years. And then I also had a number of southern states, but my region would change from year to year. But I was responsible to read all of the applications from my region and to know who were the strongest students, and then to go into committee and advocate appropriately. And that meant advocating for admit or for deny, or in some cases, if it was early decision, for a deferral, and if it was regular decision, for a wait list. But, and it was really just a quick conversation. It could take 30 seconds. The committee chair could look at my, what I had recommended when I did the initial read and say, that looks appropriate, and we're done. It could be a 1-minute conversation. It could, in some rare cases, be a 5-minute conversation. But for the most part, it's a pretty quick decision-making process. I mentioned that I chaired selection committee for athletics. I also chaired regular selection committee. And, my job then was simply to look to the regional director of admissions for that territory and say, is this student standing out? We did a cursory look at where their academics were, but we were mostly focusing when we were looking at students, if they were at committee, they were academically viable, right? They were already competitive. So really the question was, what is this student bringing to the table? What would make them a good addition to the class for the coming year? And the interesting thing about that is it could change from year to year, right? Mm-hmm. So it's what you were looking for in a given year might change. And so I will have stolen this comment from any number of admissions officers out there. I know the person that I worked with at Penn who first said it, but there's any number of people who say this, but sometimes you're an oboe in a piccolo year. And what that means is some years the orchestra needs oboes, and you get 3 or 4 kids who play the oboe, and a couple of them are competitive, and you're like, ooh, the orchestra had said they need oboes this year. So those kids who are playing oboes might have a little bit of an edge, right? And then the next year, the orchestra says, we have plenty of oboes. Thank you so much. That was very helpful. Now we're set. Now we need piccolos. Now you get 5 oboe players, and that's not necessarily a draw for us because we already have oboes. We're looking for piccolo players that year. And so if you can broaden that out to sort of everything, that is what you're trying to do in that committee room. You're really just trying to craft a class. One interesting thing that I always want to mention when we talk about committees is the way that Harvard does committee. They have everyone in one room, and you might have 30 people in there, and the student might come up for conversation, and they're going to vote whether that student, they're going to admit that student or not admit that student. So you have 30 people, 16 people could say nope, and 14 could say yes. And if 16 people say no, you're out, right? But the reverse could also happen where 16 people could say yes and 14 could say no, and then, you're in. So it's a very human process. Those are basically the steps that you go through to admit your incoming class.
So do the students who unfortunately don't make the cut, do they have an option to appeal an admission officer's decision?
I would say not really. So there are universities out there that have an appeal process, and you can certainly always look to see if the university has a specific appeal process. But at Penn, we did not. We did regularly get phone calls after decisions went out, and that was part of our job, was to field those phone calls. But really, the goal in those phone calls was just to sort of help them understand that this was, in fact, a really nice application, but unfortunately, we had so many of those, and you didn't really make the cut. So, it was a rare thing that you would point to one specific thing in an application to say to a student, this is why. And the reason for that is because, generally speaking, you really couldn't necessarily point to a reason why a student didn't get in. It was much easier to point to a reason why a student did get in, which is hard, right? You want to know, but what about my application wasn't good enough? The application could have been great, but there were a few others that were a little bit more interesting, a little bit more compelling. The student had accomplished something more unique. It was rarely, if ever, because one student had better grades than another. It was they'd done something more interesting outside of the classroom. The support from the school community was overwhelming, where you were getting letters of recommendation from their teachers that said things like, "This is the best student I've taught in my 30-year career," things like that really could take a student from being very competitive to so compelling that you really wanted to admit them to the class.
So at what stage or at what point in reading an application do you really make that decision? Yes, the student really stands out.
It's a great question. It's not when you're looking at the transcript or when you're looking at the test scores. So when I read a file, I would always look at the transcript and the test scores first. I was looking on the transcript to make sure that the student had taken the most rigorous curriculum available to them at their school, right? So we weren't looking for specific courses or, there wasn't a checklist that I had that, they have to have all of these courses. But what I did know was what was available to the student, because I had a profile that the school provided to me, and then what they opted to take. And then I would look at how they did in that curriculum, right? So I wanted most rigorous curriculum available. I wanted them to be in math, science, English, history, and foreign language, ideally all 4 years of school. And I wanted them to be doing very well in that curriculum, which means primarily getting A's. And I was looking at test scores, and I wanted them to be at a certain level on the test scores. And the SAT, I always encourage students to have a 750 or higher in each section. On the ACT, a 34 or higher. To be in the mix, for it to not be an issue, is kind of how I would present it. So an 800 in your math doesn't necessarily mean, 800 math, we got to admit this kid. All it means is, okay, this student is very accomplished when it comes to taking that math test. I'm not worried about that. That's not going to be an issue in committee if I advocate for this student. So I'm not making there's no leaning at that point at all. It's when I start getting into, from there, I would go and look at what was the student involved in outside of the classroom? And that would tell me a lot. Were they involved? Were they consistent in their involvement? Did they have leadership in their involvement? Was their involvement limited to their school or not in their school at all? Either one was fine. But did their involvement go maybe beyond the school community? Did they have accomplishments that really put them, in the next tier? Maybe they debated and they were a really strong debater at their school, but then they also went and they won a state competition. And then maybe they, in addition to that, they were competing at a national level and winning. That's something that would really start to form, okay, so this student has some real significant achievements. That's just one example. I find that when I have these conversations, people hinge on or latch on to it's debate. They've got to be great debate. No, maybe they were a great writer and they were writing for their newspaper they had been writing for the newspaper since freshman year. And then they worked their way up to be editor-in-chief by senior year. And then in addition to that, they had done a selective writing program over the summer. Maybe they'd won some awards for their writing. And then they also had a regular column in their local newspaper, right? So their accomplishments tended to be more deep and narrow than to be kind of surface and in a lot of different things. I would say that when I started to see students who really had some significant accomplishments, that's when I started to say, okay, this student has potential. I was giving that a rating as well, right? So we rated every section of the application, and so I was giving that a rating as well. Then I would look at what their teachers had to say about them, because you can have a wonderful student who's doing great things grade-wise and test-wise, doing interesting things outside of the classroom, but are they a good member of the community? Or am I hearing kind of bland support from a teacher? Are they, oh, the student is very diligent. They, they always hit their deadlines. These are great, by the way, great personal qualities. Being diligent, hitting deadlines, getting your assignments in on time, and giving them the attention that they deserve is great. Unfortunately, it's not exciting. And so with an exciting student, you tended to see language and support that was a little bit more, like I said, this is one of the best students I taught this year. This is the best student I taught this year. This is one of the top 3 students I've taught in my 15-year career. This is the best student I've taught in 30 years, right? So the letters for the students who started to look more and more interesting tended to have excelled, just like with everything else, a little bit beyond everybody else. And that would come across in the letters of support. And then I would turn to their personal presentation, so the essays that they're writing, and see if everything else kind of came together. I was forming a picture of the student and who they were and what was important to them based on what they were involved in. And then I hoped to learn just more about the student in their own words when I turned to their essays. And so I could be leaning towards admit for a student. And if I got to the essay and it was hastily thrown together, or maybe about something that was a little bit unsavory or really flat, and I didn't learn anything new about the student, then it tended to be, that was tougher to kind of say, yes, this is someone we want. Which is not to say that a brilliant essay makes up for deficiencies in other areas, because it definitely doesn't. But what it can do is really add that last piece that makes you say, yes, this is someone we want on our campus. And I do want to be clear, I could count on one hand the number of essays I read that were really brilliant pieces of writing, where I sat up and said, wow, this student is a writer. Most of the essays were not that, like not by a long shot. But what they were was they nailed the grammar, but more importantly, they really helped me understand something interesting, new, different about the student. Their personality would come through in many cases. Like there was just something about it that you felt like, oh, I feel like I know this student a little bit better having read what they've written. At Penn, one thing that really could, and not just at Penn, but the schools have supplemental essays. And that was another place where I was really looking to match the student to the campus. Could I picture them on our campus? If I could do that, you were already way ahead of everybody else in terms of, now I'm really leaning admit. So I would say it builds gradually. And for me, in the order in which I read things, by the time I got to the essays, if they were as strong as the rest, that's when I was like, yeah, this is someone that that I think we want to admit. Now, if I had 30 files in one day, might have been really compelling on the first file, for whatever reason, might have ended up looking kind of by file number 30. So that's why you read everybody first, and then you go to committee, because sometimes you do revise your opinion. Maybe a student you were sort of like, yeah, all right, he's fine. Later on, you're like, actually, that kid was kind of a standout compared to a lot of other students I've seen, maybe from that state, or maybe who are applying to this particular school at Penn. So it's an evolving process. And at least at Penn and at many of the most selective schools, most of them, you're really trying to get the whole picture before you start to actually make choices. Yeah.
Perfect. So you touched up on the grades, the course selection in high schools, the test scores, SATs. So typically from a parent perspective, if a student has check marked all of these, the perception is, yes, my kid is eligible for elite universities, and we start, aspiring for them.
Of course.
So you also mentioned belonging to the community and an admissions officer getting the feel of the right fit. So in several countries, for example, Middle East right now, or developing countries like India, there are limited opportunities. Yeah. What would you suggest parents or students to sort of get that personal project going or that excellence in their application? What would be a few things, you can talk about just to give them some ideas?
Absolutely. I think first place to start, and I always get excited when I talk to students and parents who are starting at the right place, which is they're starting with, what do I enjoy? What am I interested in? Rather than, what do the colleges want to see? Because as we've just established, we don't really know what they want to see. And that what they want to see we know what they want to see in terms of grades and test scores, right? And we know what they want to see involvement and interests and interest development. But what those are, really, it's really, you look to the students to kind of guide you on that. I've learned so many interesting things. So I had a student a few years ago I worked with who had a real interest in art and medicine. And she had combined that, and her goal or real interest at that point, I'm not sure where she wound up ultimately in her career because she's graduated from college by now, but was she really wanted to be a medical textbook illustrator. She saw that as a true art. She loved the human body. She loved things related to medicine, and she loved art and was very skilled. And so she just kind of put those interests together and pursued them. She had taken art classes, she had taken the pure sciences, and then done some anatomy courses on top of that, and really done her homework. And she applied to schools that had strong programs in both art and in biology, in anatomy, in medicine, sort of, but medicine is really not something at the undergraduate level in the US, right? And it was very unique. I had never even heard of this before. And when I read the application, I thought, I was working with her on this side of the desk, right? I was no longer an admissions officer, but I thought, this is really unique. And I think that this is going to stand out. And it did. She got into all of the highly selective schools that she applied to. And I think it was largely because she had just combined her interests in a very unique way. But the most important thing that she did was she started with her interests. And that's what students really, really have to do. So, that's one example. Another example, I worked with a student who had a real interest in the environment. He was a sailor, and he spent a lot of time on the water, and he decided to get involved with a local organization that was trying to make sure that the water remained clean, free of pollution. And that led to an interest in environmental science in general. His school offered some courses. He made sure to take all of those courses. He started a group dedicated to improving the environment in school, got a bunch of kids to join, established it as an ongoing group so that even when he graduated, it would be there after he left. They started recycling at the school level. He did more stuff related to that in the community. He ultimately his father was an architect, and he became lead certified. He was the youngest person at that time, I think. I'm not sure if it was in the country or in a state, who was LEED certified. So he had this real interest, and he just pursued it to the nth degree. And when that got into his applications, first of all, it was easy for him to talk about why he had done all of this because he had such a personal connection to it. And it just kind of leapt off the page when you were reading the file. So I guess those are examples, right? But my general advice is start with the things that you're interested in. They don't have to be academic necessarily at all in nature. They could just be something you enjoy doing. But if you can think about, maybe you have a couple of different interests, can you combine those in a more interesting or unique way? If you are interested in something that's really commonplace, and I would say, I mean, obviously, you know what the students are interested in from the Middle East. I would say here in the US, medicine is very common for very bright students. Business is very common for very bright students. Engineering, same thing. Those aren't the only things that they do, but those are three that really stand out. Computer science is another one. So I always encourage students to think about, okay, you have this thing that you want to do that a ton of people want to do. You could go a traditional path, right? You could say, I volunteered for medicine, for example. Okay, I'm going to volunteer in a hospital. I'm going to do a summer program related to science. I am going to load up on lab sciences, and then I'm going to pursue a biology major when I get to college. Well, I could tell you that when I was reading files at Penn, there were days where, as I mentioned, I read 30 files a day. There were days where I read literally 30 files of students who had volunteered at a hospital, done really well in all their science and math coursework in high school, and wanted to be biology majors in college. And there were so many of them that they all kind of blended together and became not the most compelling group. So if you're looking at something that everybody or many people are looking at and want to do, how can you approach it from a different angle? You know, could you look at medicine from a public health perspective? Big problem right now, right? In the US, we have all of this stuff going on with anti-vaccines, and how is that impacting, you know, the country as a whole, maybe your individual state, maybe your individual community, right? Can you investigate? Can you go beyond just, I want to wear that white coat and treat patients, and find a different angle in? Same thing for finance. A lot of times students are interested in business or finance because they want to make a lot of money. And, you know, a lot of money is a nice thing. You can do a lot with a lot of money. But if that's your sole reason for pursuing it, you're going to look a lot like a lot of other students. So what else can you get at? How do you want to make that money? If it's finance, why finance? But is there a different angle of business that you really want to explore? If you're an entrepreneur, because I do have a lot of students who will say, I want to start my own business. Okay, talk to me about the businesses you want to start. And then maybe you want to start a business. You can do this already. But if you're going to do that, you have to follow through, right? It's not enough to say, oh, I started this business. I would say one business that a lot of young men seem to want to start these days, which is one reason I would not encourage it because so many are doing it, but like a sneaker cleaning business. The first time I heard that, I was like, that's so interesting. The 30th time I heard it, I said, okay, that's not the most compelling thing I've ever heard in my life. But at least if you're going to do it, if you're going to have a sneaker cleaning business, have it be a real business. Make it quantifiable. Have a lot of clients. Be able to cite your numbers and your cash flow and talk to us about how you reinvested your money. Like, approach it from a true businessman's perspective. If you're going to do something like that. So my biggest piece of advice is absolutely start with your interests.
Perfect.
And then from there, see how you can pursue them in interesting ways.
Perfect. Now, the Ivy Leagues or the elite universities, they look for students who will shape the class. I've heard this so many times. And not just fill the class. So what does it mean to build a class, and how does that process lead to qualified students getting denied?
Right. Well, I think the thing to keep in mind is that I would say, we talk a lot about the colleges are looking to see, can you do the work? At the most selective levels, where they are turning away the most students, they get tons of applications, they turn away the most students. Estimation would be that 90% of the applicants could do the work. Maybe 2/3 to 3/4 are actually very competitive from the perspective of how well they've done in school, how well they've done on their tests. But beyond that, even, there are plenty of students in the applicant pool, most, that could come. They might struggle a little initially, but they could do the work depending on what they're going to major in. Right now, if they have not taken calculus by the time they're a senior and they're going into an engineering program, that maybe they would really struggle there. But maybe not, because maybe they just didn't have that opportunity at their local high school.
Yeah.
So I do want to be clear. It's really not about can you do the work. It is really about what makes the most interesting class. And so if you are looking at 50,000 applicants and your class size is 2,000, you have to appreciate that if 90% of 50,000 students can do the work, and maybe 3/4 of those 50,000 actually look pretty competitive in terms of their grades and their test scores, the likelihood that any student is getting in is really very slim, because the numbers just wouldn't support it, right? No Ivy class is admitting 60,000 students. They've made themselves very small and inaccessible, and that's why everyone wants it. And then some students, might get into more than one Ivy, right? So some students might only stand out at one school, and some might stand out at every school that they apply to. There's really no way to know how that's going to be, because every school is different. And I can't tell you how many times I would get a phone call from a parent. Well, what do you mean Penn didn't take her? She got into Stanford. That's amazing. She has Stanford, right? She didn't stand out for us. She wasn't unique for us. And I do think that's another mistake that I see parents making, usually more than students, occasionally students, but it's usually more parents than students. But how is it possible that this school, which we think is better than that school, this school admitted our child and this school turned our child down? Well, they're different institutions. They have different needs. They have different applicant pools. And they may have gotten the impression that student wasn't as interested in them as in another school, or there's so many different reasons. But so why do students get denied? Well, on the surface of it, it's a numbers game, right? You just simply cannot admit everyone who applies. But then beyond that, you just, you're looking to admit, all of these schools are looking to admit students from ideally all 50 states. That was definitely a focus for us. If there was a state where we didn't have a student where we'd admitted them, so if we were like doing the reckoning of, okay, we've admitted all these students and now we're looking at them collectively as a class. Oh, wait a second. We don't have anyone from Montana. Let's go back and look at those students from Montana that we didn't admit. Is there someone in there that would be a fit and we somehow missed them? So, right, so you want geographic diversity. You want students from as many different foreign countries as you can get, because that's, when you stand up in front of visiting families who are interested in your school and considering whether or not to apply, you want to talk about, we have students from all 50 states, we have students from more than 130 countries or however many countries, right? And you do that very intentionally by making sure when you are admitting that you are trying to get as many students who can come and do the work from as many different locations as possible. Because you also feel like that makes things more interesting. If you come to one of these places, you are most likely going to be in class with students from places, in some cases, you may never have even heard of, but often certainly never been to. Right? So you might have someone in a class from Africa, you might have someone from the Middle East, you might have someone from Europe, you might have someone from Canada, some from Mexico, from the US. Like, what an amazing experience in that class, especially if it's a discussion-based class, because all of these students are bringing every different experience that they have from their youth, growing up in these other places. So that's a big focus for all of these schools. Then you want to, you're hoping to get a wide variety of backgrounds and interests. You can't admit only students who want to be doctors, right? You can't admit only students who want to study business or engineering. You have a variety of programs. You want all of them to continue to have students and to support those majors. So you're looking for a wide range of interests. Because you also think that's going to make the class more interesting. You want that, ideally, your male to female ratio to be pretty, as close to 50-50 as you can get it. So that's important to you as well. So, and at Penn, we had the 4 different schools. We admitted to the 4 different schools. So we had a class size for each of the schools. And, the smallest was nursing, and then I believe Wharton, and then engineering, and then the College of Arts and Sciences. And so, we were admitting students only to the school that they applied to. So it wasn't like if you applied to nursing and you didn't get in, we then considered you for the college. If you weren't, if you didn't make the cut in nursing, then you're out. We can't consider you for anything else. And, every one of these schools functions differently and operates differently. But in essence, those are the bigger picture decisions that you're making. And so then once you admit the entire class in committee or however that school does it, then, like I said, you look at all the numbers and you see, do we have adequate representation across the board? And if you don't, then you start making tweaks. You might send someone who was admitted to committee onto the wait list, or even into the deny pile. You might pull someone out of deny and put them on the wait list. You might pull someone from wait list and pull them into the admit. You might pull a deny into the admit. You would do a variety of things before you sent your decisions out, so that you were really crafting a class rather than just admitting, because there really was no way to say, oh, these people are the best. It was really, what is the best for what we're looking for this year, for this interesting class.
Perfect. I think that makes a lot of sense. And that's something students need to start thinking through.
Yes.
Earlier in the years in high school and doing their research. Now, the most important topic, essays.
Yes.
This is where students struggle. And so many strong students quietly lose their chances just because they probably don't have the creativity to put their accomplishments on the application. So what are most common mistakes you've seen in students while reading some of their essays?
Sure. Well, I think the most common mistake that I saw at Penn was leaving any number of the essays to the last minute, right? So maybe they spent months working on their primary essay, but then they got to one of the supplemental essays that we required, and they wrote it in the half hour before they submitted their application, and it showed, right? Or they just didn't give any of the essays the time and attention that they needed. That was the biggest mistake that I saw. I think another big mistake would be just essentially giving us a version of their activities list in essay form. Like, first I did this, then I did this, then I did this. So trying to tell us everything they ever did, which we already knew from the activities list. I think another mistake that they made was trying to be someone that they weren't in their essay. And by that, I mean, the most successful essays, I can almost hear the student's voice in my head. It sounds like a teenager. It doesn't sound like they wrote with a thesaurus sitting right by the computer. They aren't trying to be funny if they're not funny, or trying to be serious if they are funny. Funny is underrated, highly underrated. Now, if you're not funny, don't try to be funny. But if you are naturally a funny person, be that person in your essay. I would say probably, aside from not taking the time to write it, the other thing students really seem to struggle with is being themselves in their essay. It's like they sit down in front of the computer, and I get it. It's the weight of, oh my goodness, this is the most important piece of writing I'll ever do. It's not. It's not. I know you think it is, but it's not. But if you can kind of get that out of your head. And then they try to be who they think the admissions office wants to see. You have no idea who's reading your essay. You don't know how old that person is. You don't know what that person likes or dislikes. You really just have to, in the end, just be true to who you are. Give them a glimpse, tell one story, but go deep. Rather than try and tell your entire life story. If we all wanted to write our life stories, if we wrote about every single thing that had ever happened to us in our lives, right? Like, I could fill the building I'm sitting in up with volumes, given my age, right? So you have to really you have to narrow it down and focus. You can't write about everything, but also it doesn't have to be so serious. It doesn't have to be so formal. Don't swear. That is, students said, well, you wanted it to sound like me. Well, okay, but it can't sound like you on a night out with your friends because you really don't know who's reading this. And while that wouldn't necessarily offend me, my committee chair might be offended by it. Or, the person who's reading your application might be offended, and you do kind of have to. So from that perspective, and I would encourage the writing to be, it's an essay. When I tell horror stories, I once had a student write their why Penn in, they wrote Penn in a big bubble letters. They drew Penn, and then they wrote like beautiful, Philly, like different adjectives. And I actually had really been enjoying the student's application, and I got to that and I thought, no, I wanted an actual essay. They didn't provide it. And it was juvenile, and I knew it would never have flown in committee. So being overly creative is overrated. Writing a poem instead of writing an essay. If you are a poet, you could always submit a couple of samples of your work as an addition, but don't substitute it for your essay. I also think a lot of students out there read sample essays that are available and think, oh, I need to copy that. I need that cool hook to kind of write about. I'm going to compare myself to a can of seltzer and write a whole essay from that perspective. If I never read another essay that had that cool hook, I would be a happier person, and I would guess that most admissions officers feel the same way. Just be more straightforward and more who you are if you can.
Perfect. So, few very good points I think you mentioned. One essay that every student has to write, irrespective of the university. For example, why Stanford, why Penn? What would you say students must focus on a few points? Because I think students don't understand and they try and pick up stuff from the website without correlating it in the right form. So any tips on that would be great.
Yes, absolutely. I think that it's the most important thing about these essays is ideally they're going to help you picture that student on campus, taking advantage of what's available to them on campus. You don't want to read marketing copy. I work for this institution. I know it's great. I think it's great. You don't need to tell me how great I am or how great the institution is. And I also don't want stuff that everybody could write about. At Duke, very common for students to write about the basketball arena where the team plays. It wasn't uncommon for students writing their why Penn to mention Locust Walk. It's not a bad thing to mention those necessarily. The essays now are kind of on the short side, and so if you can avoid writing about something that everyone is going to point to, I would do that. It can't be generic. You can't be able to cover up the name of the institution and put in the name of a different institution and have it work without changing anything else. I encourage students to think about give me the names of a couple of specific classes you want to take and why. That will help me understand why you want to do this major at this institution versus at a different institution. What student clubs and organizations are you going to take advantage of, and why? Why do you want to join that? What are your goals for your time in college, and how are you going to take advantage of things at the institution in order to achieve those goals? So if you can be thoughtful about your own goals, you absolutely have to go to the school's website and do research. You cannot write a strong why this college essay without specifics about the institution, and they should be woven throughout the essay, whether it's a 500-word essay or a 100-word essay. The whole thing needs to be very specific and be very specific to that institution. So that's another thing that I would see students sometimes do when why Penn was a longer essay. They might write 2 paragraphs about themselves and then get to Penn. I wanted to see Penn woven throughout the essay, and that's what I encourage students to do now when they're working on those.